Hello everyone. In this video, we'll see what are the Azure Storage Services which are offered by Azure Cloud. When you create a storage account, you have options to create multiple storage services. These storage services, it can be Azure Blobs, Azure Files, Azure Queues, Azure Disks, Azure Tables. So these are the storage services what you are going to create when you select the Azure Storage Services. So what are Azure Blobs? When you create a storage account, you can store the data in the binary format. You create a storage account and you create a container for blob storage. You will be able to store or upload the data in the blob storage as binary format. So this is the way what you are going to store the data in the blob storage. So the data what you are going to store in the blob storage, it can be simple text file, PDF file, it can be .doc file, it can be Excel file, it can be movie file, it can be MP3 file, it can be image files. So all these files are stored as a binary format. So each object what you are going to store in the blob storage, it will be called as blob. So what are Azure files? Azure files can be used as a central file share location, which will support NFS, which will also support SMB. If I have a file service FS01 and FS02, it can be in a cluster or it can be in a standalone, and I have my shares, share, HR. These are my shares which I have created on these file shares. It can be for finance share. I can move all these shares to the Azure files as the replacement for my enterprise file service on the on-prem. Azure Queues are messaging services for application which helps to store large messages. Say for example, if I have a web application, it can be in on-prem or in Azure Cloud. We have a web application. I need to have sync request to be sent to the database. And if I have asynchronous request, these requests has to be sent to the worker nodes or worker roles. So this is one worker node, this is another worker node, this is third worker node. Say for example, this is a document processing application and there are multiple users or clients which are accessing this particular web app, and for all the transaction related request it will send to the database. If there is any asynchronous request, it has to go via the queue. Asynchronous request is nothing but when the users are going to upload the documents in different sizes and it has to be sent to the Azure queue so that it will convert all these documents either into A4 or letter. So if you have an application and wanted to integrate asynchronous feature, then Azure queue will be the best fit for your application. So what are Azure disks? Azure disks are block level storage which will support Azure virtual machines. So when you create a virtual machines, you need to have operating system disks and data disks. So these disks are supported by Azure disks. So these are called as page blobs when you create a storage account. So now, since we are using the managed disks, we are not going to use the storage account and create the page blobs to use with the Azure virtual machines. We use the managed disks for the virtual machines. What are Azure tables? Azure tables are used for storing large scale of structured data. It can store terabytes of data. It is a NoSQL database and it doesn't have any schema. It is basically a non-relational database. What are the benefits of using Azure Storage? When we choose Azure Storage, we have multiple redundancy options like LRS, ZRS, GRS, and RAGRS, and other redundancy options. We can protect our data from any catastrophe or from natural disaster. Because the data is replicated multiple times, we have high availability, and the data what we are going to store in Azure Storage is highly durable. When we upload or store any data onto the Azure account, by default, the data is encrypted with the Microsoft encryption key. We can also use customer encryption key to encrypt our data. We can also use fine-grained control, which is nothing but the RBAC policy, to control our access to the storage account. In today's application architecture, we don't know what amount of data will be stored onto the Azure account. Because of that, Azure Storage will scale massively. We can store 5 petabytes of data per storage account. Because in today's application, we see that there are microservices architectures, and also there are streaming applications which use the Azure storage, which needs massive amount of storage capacity. For the end user or the customer who is going to use the Azure storage, there is no need for them to maintain or manage the storage. Azure will take care of the hardware maintenance, updates. Even if there is any critical issues on the Azure storage, Azure will handle and take care of those issues. So we have stored our data onto the Azure storage, but how do we access these storage? We can access the storage account or the blobs using the HTTP or HTTPS protocol, and we can also use PowerShell, Azure CLI, and also we have GUI tool like Storage Explorer to access the data what we have stored onto the Azure account.